Welcome to the She's Just Not That Into You podcast, where we're redefining female experiences and prioritizing female perspectives. I'm Brianne.
And I'm Ji-Yoon. We are two friends with global background, sharing our multicultural experiences and discussing everything that sparks our passion.
Every week, we have honest, intimate conversations that we hope will inspire and empower not only each other, but women everywhere.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of She's Just Not That Into You. Today we are reviewing The Substance by Coralie Fargeat. It's one of the most memorable films I've seen in a while, and we are so excited to talk about this movie.
Yeah, thank you, June, for suggesting this. It was quite an experience to watch.
It's so powerful, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'll recover from watching some of the scenes.
Yeah, it takes time to process it actually. So, yeah, I'm excited to talk about this with you today.
Yeah.
Before we actually jump into the actual discussion, I just wanted to briefly talk about the director. So, this is her second feature film, and her first one is called Revenge, that came out 2017. And even back then, the movie got a lot of buzz, and her name's been popping up a lot in Hollywood ever since. So, she has her specific style, really mixing very like sci-fi-ish kind of thriller genre with realistic themes that are really relevant, especially to women. And she's really not afraid to push boundaries in her own ways, and she really outdid herself in this movie. So this film is a brilliant feminist body horror that gives us a great commentary on aging, beauty standards, and identity that's like wrapped up in visceral, like grotesque and beautifully savage images.
Yeah, it's also interesting because the film won the very prestigious Best Screenplay Award at the Cannes Film Festival in 2024 and
Right.
also received good critical reviews, which I heard is actually quite rare for horror movies to gain that kind of recognition, because I guess is it because horror is seen as more of a kind of lowbrow genre? And I guess to win something like best screenplay at the Cannes Film Festival, you'd probably have to have something that's kind of a bit more highbrow, right?
Yeah, it definitely sets the tone for a more highbrow like film. And I think what's so fascinating about this film is how it manages to balance that kind of thing. Like, it's not just artsy for the sake of being artsy, it really gives you emotional depth as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting about this film.
Yeah. And I also wanted to share some behind the scenes information about the film's production. But bear in mind that I only read this in an article. So basically, what happened is that Universal Pictures was supposed to distribute the film, but just a few weeks before its premiere at Cannes Film Festival, they dropped the project and sold it to Mubi, which is a streamer that has a lot of like indie filmmaker driven films. And during production, Ray Liotta had been cast as Harvey, and already shot some scenes, but then he passed away, so they had to replace him with Dennis Quaid. So we can guess the production costs likely increased a lot because of that. And on top of that, Universal ran a lot of internal test screenings and insisted that the ending be changed. But the director understandably gave them a huge no. So this kind of creative conflict is what made Universal sell the film to Mubi, which ended up being a blessing for Mubi. So yeah, everything worked out in the end. The film premiered at Cannes, where it won best screenplay, and now there's a lot of buzz around it being a strong Oscar contender in multiple categories. So yeah, hearing all this from an like a producer's perspective, it really does sound like it must have been a difficult production, but I'm glad that everything really worked out. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, for any listeners who might have forgotten, June is a film producer, so I'm especially excited to talk to her about this film for that reason as well.
Yeah. Let's get started.
Yeah, so just a brief overview of what the film is about. So, yeah, as June said, it's a satirical body horror film, and it's basically about a celebrity called Elizabeth Sparkle, who, on her 50th birthday, gets fired from her job by her producer because she's deemed too old. And they run a newspaper advert trying to find a replacement for her. And in the midst of all this, she somehow comes across this black market drug called the substance, and she ends up deciding to take it so that she can make a new younger version of herself. And this younger version ends up applying for the job that she got fired from and ends up getting the job. And the film just basically is about what happens during that process. And this whole time there's actually still two separate selves, because the older self and the younger self are still both coexisting, and basically they have to switch places every other week. And yeah, it's just really interesting to see everything that goes on because of that, and the conflict between the two selves. And yeah, there's so much to talk about. In one way, this film kind of, to me, almost felt like a female retelling of The Picture of Dorian Gray,
Mm,
because it's about aging and maybe kind of the disgusting aspects of aging and the way that as humans we're kind of frightened of aging. But at the same time, the film also dove deep into themes such as misogyny and objectification of women, and yeah, that seemed very feminist. And in that way, this film reminded me of the novel Natural Beauty, which also discusses similar themes and is also a body horror story as well. And actually, one thing I did read about this film was that what is supposedly quite groundbreaking about it is that normally female body horror stories tend to deal with aspects of the reproductive system like menstruation and pregnancy, whereas
right.
this one wasn't really about that. It was almost about what life is like after you get beyond your reproductive years. So yeah, apparently that was quite innovative
Yeah.
in this film.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I think I want to start by celebrating Demi Moore's decision to be in this film and her incredible performance here.
Mm,
She was born in 1962 and she's 62 years old,
yeah.
right? And just the fact that she's doing this at her age and in itself, it is so meaningful. I could totally imagine what it must have been like for her as an actress to reach 62 doing business and everything, how much prejudice, discrimination and self-doubt and everything she's had to endure. When you think about all this, I felt such a connection to her character Elizabeth,
Hmm.
and in that sense I feel like this film has such an incredible ability to resonate across generations. And the movie shows a lot of nudity,
Yeah.
and her choice to be showing all that is just so brave and so meaningful and so powerful. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. So, what did you think was kind of the main theme of this film?
I think it touches on a lot of stuff, from aging, beauty standards, and identity, misogyny, to all sorts of different kinds of female madness, like eating disorders, like anorexia, bulimia, like binge eating, purging, and everything. Yeah, so I just feel like it shows so much about how far a woman can go when she's in this position that's constantly on display and having to live up to the societal expectations of beauty and everything.
Yeah, I felt like the opening image where they showed the behind the scenes of making the star like floor tile that says Elizabeth Sparkle, and then gradually showing how over time it cracks and gets worn down, and then everyone's completely indifferent to it, and then at the end someone drops ketchup all over it. It seems to be very symbolic, and and it foreshadows what happens for the rest of the film, which is that, Elizabeth Sparkle is new and I guess sparkly at first, but then, she becomes older and people stop paying attention to her, and then it kind of ends in violence, and the ketchup on the star seems kind of like blood, that symbolizes that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And what really kind of stayed with me was that this film makes aging, and especially female aging, seem like something really disgusting. And obviously, I guess they've used a lot of caricature and, I guess it's meant to be a body horror. So they've
Right.
really made it over the top. But I guess it's probably trying to make a point about the general societal view of women aging being something kind of frightening and unappealing. And it was kind of interesting in the scene where, I don't know if you remember, what she's cooking. This is when she's like her older self, but then she becomes way older kind of prematurely because of how the younger self keeps taking up more of her time, and then
Right.
that makes the older self become prematurely older. But there's this one scene where she's got gray hair and it's kind of frizzy, and she's really wrinkly, and she's cooking, and the way the scene is shot and everything she's doing, she kind of looks like a mad witch who's stirring her cauldron or something, which to me seemed quite symbolic of the way that society views women, and especially kind of older women, because the character of a witch to me seems like something really misogynistic, because I always was thinking, like, why is it that in fairy tales women with magical powers are witches, which end up usually being someone evil who's like the villain in the story, whereas men with magical powers are wizards who always seem to stereotypically be kind old men who are helpful and wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. The fact that they made her look like a witch when she's become older, it's kind of like, just because a woman has some wrinkles and gray hair doesn't automatically mean that her personality is also going to be evil as well.
Right.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting.
And by the time her appearance, like she looks like the witch in Snow White.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's quite over the top, right? It's the characters are quite caricature-like.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the caricature-like characters, what did you think of Harvey, the producer, played by Dennis Quaid? Because he was quite caricature-like as well, right?
Yeah. I feel like not just Harvey, but every like a male character in the movie, they all like feel like such a great critic of misogyny and the way men operate within these systems of oppression and misogyny. Like, it's not just about the individual man in this case. It's more about how men as a group perpetuate and benefit from a culture that enforces these impossible standards on women. So I think these characters were caricature like, but at the same time very like realistic in that sense.
Yeah, what you said, it reminded me of when they go to the audition, the people watching the auditions are all male, and they say to the females who are auditioning, please say your name, age, measurements, as if that's all that matters for a
Right.
woman,
So crazy.
Yeah, but I wasn't sure whether the fact that the director's name was Harvey was kind of almost pointing at Harvey Weinstein.
I think that makes sense actually.
Maybe is almost kind of like a symbolic character of a man working in Hollywood who
Right.
is very destructive towards women. And yeah, the fisheye lens that was always there whenever Harvey was on screen was really
Right.
funny, because it just made it look like he's just really like in your face all the time.
Yeah. Oh my god, it's too much.
Yeah. And then like the close-up shots where he was eating shrimps in a really violent
Oh my
and
god, that's
aggressive
so
way.
disgusting.
But I felt like it seemed almost kind of symbolic of the young women who he's destroyed during his career, because, like the shrimps are like pink and plump and juicy, which seems like
Definitely.
something kind of feminine, because it's not like he's eating like a steak, which seems almost a bit more masculine. Like, the
Right.
shrimps seem kind of like,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know, feminine. So
Right.
yeah, that was really
He's just like so like obnoxious eating all those shrimps, and he's just like so all over the place, like so disgusting.
And it was in a business meeting.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
business meeting, and he doesn't even realize that, like how Elizabeth is looking at him and everything. Like he just doesn't give a shit about it, and that's reality.
There was also that other scene where he couldn't remember his assistant's name, which was Isabella, and he says, "Oh, that's too long. Let's change it to Cindy."
Yeah, oh my god, that was so real. And adding to that point, I found it so fascinating how the narrator, like the one that kept stepping in to tell Elizabeth that, remember you're one, is male.
Oh, like the substance voice?
Yeah. It was so interesting to me how this voice behind the substance like fits into the story, because it feels like such a reflection of the mansplaining culture we live in.
Yeah.
It almost feels like he's saying, embrace yourself. Like, you're not really different. You're still the same person. But at the same time, it feels like he's adding all these, like, impossible conditions, like, stay beautiful, but not too much. Make sure you're likable. Make sure you're perfect. Make sure you're loved. Like, it gives us these impossible standards and unattainable ideal, I guess. It just feels like another way of controlling us, controlling women, like keeping us in this vicious cycle of going for something that we will never be able to fully achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it really felt real to me.
Yeah, and also I guess speaking of mansplaining and men trying to control women, I was quite shocked by the scene where she was in the consultation room at the hospital and then she was crying, but then the male doctor just leaves the room without saying anything to her and he
Right.
just leaves her there crying. I felt like, yeah, like it kind of almost foreshadowed what's going to happen with the man who is the voice behind the substance, who kind of ends up just, yeah, abandoning her. And there's nothing that happens that, takes care of her at the end or anything like that.
Right, right.
And yeah, speaking of everything you said about how the way society, or I guess the patriarchal society we live in, doesn't value women. There was the part in the newspaper ad where they were advertising for someone to replace her after she got fired from the job, and it said, "Who will be the next Elizabeth Sparkle?" Which
Mm-hmm.
females aged 18 to 30 only, which is
Yeah.
kind of, showing how women are all replaceable and you need like a younger replacement. And actually, what did you think of the way her life changed after she became a younger version of herself?
Well, I don't think I've watched this film focusing specifically on the changes. I was more drawn to how Elizabeth and Sue are essentially the same person.
Okay.
I think that really struck with me because I thought it was such a profound way to capture the internal conflicts we experience as women. For me, they feel like a visual and cinematic representation of those conflicting voices we all have in our heads. Like they embody that constant push and pull we feel within ourselves. Like, there's always this tension. Like, there's this part of us that's like growing older, the part that understands reality. Like we know that aging is inevitable and we tell ourselves we need to build a healthy relationship with it and just to accept that. But there's also another part of us that's like more toxic voice, like that clings to societal standards of beauty, which tells us it's good to be beautiful, good to be admired, good to be loved. It pushes us to try harder, do more, to constantly prove our worth through how we look, how we behave, how much society values us. Those two sides are so deeply ingrained in us. And they are sort of always like speaking over each other, like within our heads. And I think that's where the genius of this movie kicks in. Like it takes these internal struggles, these voices, and externalizes them so powerfully through these characters.
Yeah, that's so interesting because for me, I think I kind of interpreted it almost as a commentary on conflict between mothers and daughters. Um,
That's so interesting.
because it's not just that she switches every week into a different form of herself, but for example, when she's still her own older self, she watches her younger self on the television, and
Right.
so you kind of get to see them interacting with each other. Well, I guess in this scene it's a one-way interaction, but you kind of get to see them having conflict with each other, and that kind of made me feel like it was kind of reminiscent of a lot of books I've read and I guess films I've watched, where they show how a lot of the times mothers who are aging become jealous of their younger daughters. And it's almost like so there was also the scene where when Sue, the younger self, talks about Elizabeth as if she's her mother, because she refers to her as her sick mother who she has to look after. And I guess Sue does actually come out of Elizabeth, like in the
Like she's born
yeah,
out
she's
of
born out of
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And then like the way she comes out of that slit in her body like looks kind of like a vagina as well.
Yeah, and it's almost like a C-section.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I feel like the film almost tries to get us to empathize with how Elizabeth finds it really difficult to see herself getting older while her younger self, Sue, is enjoying her life and has all these opportunities ahead of her. And I feel like this is how a lot of mothers feel towards their daughters as well. But then I feel like the conflict between the two selves and, the fact that there's that violent scene at the end where they're fighting against each other, and then Sue, the younger self, ends up killing the older self. Well, firstly, I wasn't expecting that scene to happen at all, so it was super
Right.
shocking.
It's so unexpected. Didn't see that
Yeah.
coming.
But I guess it does kind of show how worrying about aging is so self-destructive. Yeah, because she literally ends up killing this woman who is actually herself as well.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. And I feel like the opening image was quite symbolic, the one where they kind of show this needle in making an injection into the yolk of a raw egg, and then another yolk forms. So it ends up being like an egg with two yolks. I feel like it kind of foreshadows the fact that she's going to be split into two selves.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was really effective because they
Mm.
look exactly the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then later on, there was that other scene where she's frying eggs in a frying pan, and then there's two
Right.
yolks again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was that scene where she's getting ready when the Elizabeth, the older self, is getting ready to go on a date, and
Oh my
she.
god. I wanted to talk about this one too.
Yeah, what did you think of that?
Oh my god, I felt so sad. Like that scene made me feel so sad, like so devastated. Like I don't even know how to describe it. Like it was so heartbreaking. Like we all had those moments where we are just constantly changing, like changing clothes, changing makeup, like trying to fix something about ourselves, like whether it's because of aging beauty standards or just the pressure society puts on us is something so many of us go through, right? And that scene was incredible because as she keeps changing, like we start to see her imperfections. Like when she's getting ready, at first she looks really beautiful, like really perfect, but then with every little adjustment she makes, we start like noticing the wrinkles, her imperfect skin, like her like flaws. So by the end, it's like the more she changes, the more her face becomes like quote unquote ugly. So it was really powerful because it felt like watching someone self-destruct.
Mm.
Yeah. What did you think of that scene?
Yeah, I think I can't remember exactly where, but I remember I was either reading in a book or watching in a film where there was a scene where I think it was a mother getting ready to go on a date, and then she was feeling more and more insecure about herself by looking at her younger daughter and like comparing herself with that. So it did kind of remind me of that as well. going back to what I said about how I feel like there was a commentary on conflict between mothers and daughters when it comes to aging. But also, I felt like that scene was really interesting to compare with the way her body and her self-image is shown in the scenes where she's her younger self.
Yeah.
Because I felt like the film made a strong commentary on the hypersexualization of youth in
Right.
females. And I noticed how the shots of the film and the way the film was portraying her naked body were so different when she was old compared to when she was young. Because when
Yeah.
she was her young self, I felt like the scenes are all suddenly super sexualized. And even like the workout classes she does suddenly become super sexual as soon as she becomes younger. And then there's even like all the scenes where when she's the younger self, even when she's like drinking Coke from a can, there's a lot of like close up shots of her ass as she's walking around her apartment.
Yeah.
So it's almost like her younger self kind of becomes more and more naked and exposed, while the older self begins to cover herself up more and more. And, you know, she ends up wearing first, she wears the coat, and then she starts to wear sunglasses and then gloves. And then she's got like a hat. And then, you know, she just becomes more and more inconspicuous until eventually at the end, she just completely covers herself up with a blanket. So, yeah, I felt like the scene where, yeah, she's getting ready to go on the date and she's, you know, having to try all these different types of makeup and change the clothes she's wearing and stuff. I feel like it kind of shows how, I don't know, I feel like in our society, women are expected to put more effort into covering up their imperfections as they get older. Whereas for some reason, society is kind of really focused on fetishizing young women and want them to be as exposed as possible.
Yeah, because, you know, from the society's point of view, it's more beautiful. So they want to see more of that, I guess.
Yeah. But then aging, like women who are aging shouldn't be seen as less beautiful, right?
Yeah, but it's so hard to get away from it, though. Because we end up internalizing that kind of misogyny ourselves. Like, we look back and we think our younger selves were more beautiful, and we constantly wish we could go back to that. It's just this never ending trap, like the obsession with youth. And that's why we see everyone getting all different kinds of skincare routines, plastic surgery treatments, and everything, like whatever it takes. It's everywhere, like all the time. It just becomes such a normal part of our daily lives.
Yeah, and they even kind of like show why a woman would want to go to such great lengths to preserve her youth as well, because they even show how other characters act so differently towards her when she's young compared to when she's old. For example, the man who lives in her apartment is suddenly super nice to her when she's young,
Right.
but he's not that nice to her when she's old. And even when she's just walking on the street, she gets so much attention from people when she's young, and career opportunities and everything are just so much better when she's her younger self, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And we don't even have to go that far. We actually experience that kind of thing in our daily life as well. Like, I've experienced that kind of thing so much in my life as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, based on how I present myself.
Yeah.
Going back to the hypersexualization of youth, I know that a lot of people actually criticize this film for having so many sins from a male gaze. I guess hypersexualization is also male gaze a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But I think that was really intentional, because when we see Sue, we immediately think that, oh, this is from like a male perspective. But at the same time, I feel like so much of what we call male gaze is actually something that we've internalized. It's not just how men see us, it's also how we want to be seen by the world and by men. It's almost as she isn't just being watched by other people, she's observing herself through their eyes. So I feel
Yeah.
like we internalize that perspectives in such detail that we become our own viewers. So instead of seeing ourselves, we spend so much of time and energy imagining how we to the world and to other people, right?
Through the eyes of men.
yeah, through the eyes of men. And I think the cinematography and the perspectives and everything really show that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And yeah, I guess, the camera focuses on what aspects of the body a man would focus on, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like
Yeah.
her boobs and her ass and
But only when she's young. Like when
yeah,
she's her old self, the camera doesn't focus on that because men don't notice women after they reach a certain age, I guess.
right. And they
That's the
don't even
comment.
know where to look at, you know? It's just it always shows like the full image as sort of like a, I don't know, like a disaster or something. It doesn't focus on like a specific body part or something, but it
Yeah.
just, yeah, just the whole imagery.
Yeah. Actually, so speaking of her two selves, I wanted to ask you which one did you like more, or like did you have one that you empathized with more or liked more than the other one? The old self or the young self?
I think honestly both, because I watched the film seeing them as the conflicting voices within one person, and because of that I found myself constantly switching back and forth between the two. They're similar in some ways, but also so different. So I could relate to each of them in their own way, I think, like depending on the moment. Yeah, what about you?
So, firstly, I didn't like that the younger one was portrayed as being a bit dumb and clueless and lacking in personality. Although
Like
maybe,
airheaded?
yeah, although maybe
Yeah.
that was meant to be a commentary on how
Yeah.
society views younger women because her beauty is really fetishized, but then like she's also seen as being a bit, yeah, vapid and not
Yeah.
really having any substance. But I think I probably liked the old version more, maybe because we met her first, so I felt like I knew her better, but also I feel like she had more personality. Yeah, so I think that was the only reason why. But yeah, I felt like I could kind of empathize with her point of view more because of that,
Mm-hmm.
because I never
Mm-hmm.
really knew what the younger one was thinking. Yeah.
But I feel like, as you said, like how Sue is portrayed throughout the whole film, I think it's a is just a whole like a social commentary on how society sees younger women.
Yeah, speaking of which, this film also makes a commentary on eating disorders as well, like
Yeah,
anorexia and bulimia. Did you want to
right.
talk about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on that. I absolutely loved how the film uses so many powerful symbols to talk about eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. Like there's one scene that really stood out to me. It was when Elizabeth completely loses control and just starts eating like a crazy person, and it was so overwhelming to watch. Like the food is everywhere. Like it was just a disaster, like spilling over the whole moment. It felt really intense, and I felt like it wasn't really just about eating. It's about this uncontainable almost surge, something that's even a lot more horrifying than just food. It's like madness, but also sadness. Like I don't know. It was just like watching someone going crazy. And then there's those scenes where Elizabeth throws up, like the green fluid spilling out of her.
Yeah.
Yeah, they feel symbolic as well, not just as a physical act, but an emotional one too. It felt more than just rejecting the food she's consumed, but it felt more like rejecting everything society forced into her, like the expectations, the pressures, and everything.
That's so interesting. Speaking of that, what did you think of the final scene?
I actually had to watch it through my fingers because it was so intense. And but I think it's such a symbolic moment. It perfectly captures how far female madness can go. You know, like the final scene is just is the culmination of everything the film has been building toward, right?
Mm,
The chaos, the conflicts, the insane pressures, all of it just explodes in this one horrifying, really grotesque moment. And the tension was so real. Like Do you remember like when Sue was running to the toilet, like completely freaking out, and her teeth were falling out, like literally everything was falling out, and she's like bleeding, and one of her ears starts falling off. It was so grotesque, but also heartbreaking actually. And what was even crazier, even with her body parts literally falling apart, she was still so desperate to stay in the show. Like that obsession with wanting to be part of it, like wanting to be seen, wanting to be accepted. It's just pure madness. But it was also just so telling, right? Yeah, it was just this powerful metaphor for how society pushes women to destroy themselves just to meet these impossible expectations. What about you? What did you think about the final scene?
Well, so basically, just to briefly summarize, she ends up, yeah, going onto the stage, and there's just like blood coming out of her everywhere. And like in the end, like everyone who's come to watch the show, like every member of the audience, just everyone is like covered in her blood. Like there's just like blood
Yeah,
everywhere.
yeah,
It's really over the top. And it actually kind of reminded me of Quentin Tarantino's film Inglorious Bastards. The scene with the stage, and like it's like really violent. And
right.
yeah, and in that sense, this film did kind of remind me of Quentin Tarantino's films in some ways, in that it
Mm-hmm.
blends highbrow and lowbrow culture together.
Yeah,
But I guess it does so in a more feminine friendly way. Whereas I guess Quentin Tarantino's films are quite masculine in terms of their violence and everything. So I kind of saw her blood being symbolic. It kind of felt almost like, at the end, like everyone in the audience is covered in her blood. And I felt like it was making the point that, her blood is on their hands, like or every member of the audience, every fan of hers, they all participated in her self destruction by favoring her youth and her beauty. So they're all kind of complicit in, what happened to her, which, by the end, she just ends up as like a patch of blood on her star, kind of like the
yeah,
ketchup at the beginning, like on her star tile.
so true.
Yeah, I felt like the blood was just making this commentary that like everyone in society participates in destroying women.
Yeah, like the audience, like they're just sitting there almost as if they're saying that this doesn't really have anything to do with me. But at the end of the day, they're all part of this huge problem, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, I feel like this film and the ending, the theme, and everything, it's such a powerful reminder that there is no space in this world for women to exist outside of these suffocating expectations.
Mm.
And that's exactly why creating space for women is so critical and important. Because I feel like right now, society only gives us two options. Like, we are either normal, fitting perfectly into the society's idea of what a woman should be like, or we are crazy. There's no room for anything in between. And I think that's exactly why we see so much focus on female madness in books, movies, and other cultural stories these days. It's like a reflection of how women are constantly pushed to this breaking point, and the madness becomes the only way their frustration can be expressed. So we are either these really beautiful women that fit perfectly into what society expects us to be, or we are shoved into this chaotic, broken, harsh stereotype. And I don't think society knows how to handle anything outside of those two extremes. And it's really depressing for us to actually live under that.
Yeah, that's so true.
And realizing that this is the reality right now and this is what we need to move away from is really important. And I think this film does help us to realize that. Okay, so I think it's a good place for us to wrap up today's episode. We've been talking about The Substance by Coralie Fargeat. It was such a deep, powerful conversation. This film is raw, unfiltered, and really powerful, but in a way that forces us to confront the harsh reality about being a woman in a world that keeps pushing us to the edge than ask us to hold it together. We cannot recommend this film enough. If you get the chance, give it a watch and share your opinions with us. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for listening to our latest episode, and if you like that, please share with a friend.
We'd also really appreciate if you could rate and review our podcast. And please get in touch if you have any feedback.
We'll be back again with another episode next week.